In 1945, when German troops laid down their arms, Europe lay in ruins. Germany had been ravaged, its people sunk to depths of despair. The fighting had displaced 30 million or more Europeans, and most had little means to get home, if they still had a home to return to. Years of war had shattered the economies of already poor countries like China and Japan, Indonesia and the Philippines, and had left their governments unstable.
French and Americans of the 7th Army make a whirlwind campaign of southern France. In conjunction
Americans who had fought in these far-off places had their blinders ripped off. They lost that sense of isolation which had colored our national character. Many of the men drawn to Youth for Christ had crossed cultures as well as oceans during the war. Bob Evans, Art Brown, Tal McNutt, Ted Rowe, Bob Murphin, the list goes on and on. They had seen the world, and they had gained a growing awareness of their place in it, and that included a call to serve. As Billy Graham wrote later, something happened which radically changed the course of Youth for Christ. We crossed the oceans, sped to the islands, spared no money or men to carry the gospel as far as we could into as many lands as possible. With rallies springing up all over the country, Torrey took a team, including Billy, to tell Great Britain and the continent what God was doing in the New World. They toured England, Scotland, Ireland, Sweden, Norway, held meetings in packed halls and preached to people, as Graham wrote later, who were starved for hope and hungry for God. At the second annual convention, all the talk was about overseas and the world program of Youth for Christ. Torrey and Billy gave their reports. Fire swept through the grounds. Teams began to organize. It was during that trip to England, the summer of '46, that Torrey got his big idea. A World Youth Congress. Get delegates from all over the world. Get the leading evangelicals. Get everyone who cares about the aimlessness of today's youth who have no spiritual ground and are being sucked into worldly success. It would be hard to beat Beatenberg for inspiration. Phil and Louis checked out the site while they were in Europe. It would also be hard to beat the list of who's who that attended that conference that summer of 1948. 230 delegates. Earl Schultz visited the site years later.
Well, here's where that famous picture was taken of the delegates for the First World Congress on Youth Evangelism here in Beatenberg, Switzerland.
Today, the name Beatenberg still electrifies these pioneers. That conference kicked off a whirlwind of evangelistic effort all over the globe. When the Congress closed, the delegates fanned out across Europe. Torrey preached in the old Roman arena in Nimes, France, where Christian martyrs had once been thrown to the lions. Phil and Louis went back to Italy and took Oswald Smith with them. Beatenberg was the first of many world congresses to follow. Cannes in the south of France, Brussels, Belfast, Tokyo, Sao Paulo, and all of them featured teams of youth leaders, holding meetings all through that part of the world, and planting seeds that often took root and became a local Youth for Christ rally. Just about every leader in the movement, it seemed, helped to export the growing ministry to some corner of the world. Talk about airplanes and all that travel. Louis Palermo tells about the first trip he and Phil made across the Atlantic, when not many people had made the trip.
We were going to fly from New York to London. That was a Constellation plane. Remember those planes with three tails in the back? Non-stop. So we were telling that in Minneapolis to a meeting, and there was my mother-in-law's dear old friend. She came up to me and said, "You know, boys, I'm going to pray for you all night when you go over the ocean." She said, "Do you remember Charles Lindbergh when he flew? I prayed for him all night, and he got there."
The spontaneity and the speed with which the movement grew in the States was present in Europe and Africa, India, South America, and down under. In New Zealand, youth workers had begun holding upbeat youth rallies in neutral auditoriums long before any foreign Youth for Christ workers set foot there. Under Bob Cook, someone counted 76 countries in which Youth for Christ held at least one meeting. But Cook knew it was the Spirit, not any one man, who had blown the Youth for Christ ship so far, so fast. Finally, the man who had once lamented the loss of the early leaders of the movement took his own leave in 1957 and turned the helm over to Ted Engstrom. 6'2" Ted, known as a solid manager, had run the organization for 6 years as the executive director, and he knew it well. But it wasn't the easiest time to take over. A new breed of so-called racehorses was coming on the scene, and the youth culture was changing. The Cold War was on, and anti-communism had become a religion in itself. Americans had more and more leisure time. Critics deplored the mass culture spawned by television. New York Times reporter Harrison Salisbury, writing about youth, called them the shook-up generation. Around the world, however, in Germany, Korea, Holland, India, Singapore, France, the movement was growing, with each national group becoming a full partner in a truly international Youth for Christ.